Thanks so much for joining us this morning. North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles early Sunday, just days after a missile was fired over Japan, going farther than ever before. This escalation of tests has Tokyo and Washington on high alert. Mark Esper served as the U.S. Defense Secretary from 2019 to 2020 under President Trump. And before that, he was U.S. Secretary of the Army from 2017 to 2019. His book, A Sacred Oath, Memoirs of a Secretary of Defense During Extraordinary Times, was published earlier this year. Secretary Esper, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
I want to start with North Korea, if I can, because there were another 2 ballistic missiles launched over the weekend. Certainly there seems to be some sort of escalation, or at least there are more tests being done. How concerned are you about that? How concerned should we all be?
Well, you have to be concerned anytime that North Korea is launching missiles, particularly in the vicinity of Japan, the United States' close ally, and South Korea as well. This is somewhat like the 25th test of the year, and clearly what Kim Jong-un is trying to do is to get the attention of the administration, which is now focused mostly, for good cause, on Russia and Ukraine. And he has a limited time to do this because we have the Party Congress coming up in China in a week or so. So I think he's, again, trying to get the world's attention focused back on him.
Is there a seriousness to it, or is it really just about trying to say, hey, I'm still here and I'm still a threat?
Well, you always have to take these things seriously, but there is a certain predictability of this, of what happens on the Korean Peninsula. It's gone on for decades. And of course, Kim Jong-un, is concerned about joint military exercises that have occurred over the past couple months. And I might add, positively for us, that you have a closer relationship between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. And that's a good thing.
You mentioned, of course, the conflict, Russia's war on Ukraine. We have seen I think some progress by Ukraine in past weeks, but we've also seen most recently a missile strike in Zaporizhzhia just overnight, 17 people, an estimated 17 people killed. As Putin becomes more desperate, in part because Ukraine is making some strides in trying to reclaim territory and make things very difficult on the Russian military, do you think that Putin's threats of nuclear war are real and concerning from that perspective?
Well, first, let me say the Ukrainians have made incredible progress over the past 7-8 months. It's been a strategic failure after strategic failure for Vladimir Putin. And you mentioned the strikes on Zaporizhzhia this morning, of course, in response to the bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge by the Ukrainians, which was not just an operational victory, but a strategic political punch at Putin himself. But look, back to the issue of Putin and nuclear weapons, we have to take him seriously. Use of tactical nuclear weapons is possible, but I think unlikely. And so we should not be self-deterred from doing what's in the best interest of Ukraine and the alliance with regard to pushing back on Putin and giving Ukraine what it needs to win this war.
When President Biden said this week that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is at its highest level since the Cuban Missile Crisis, did you agree with that statement? Did you think that was hyperbole, or is that something that we should be thinking about?
No, complete overstatement, hyperbole. There's little comparison between the two. You know, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries' strategic systems were on alert. It was a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. We had nuclear-armed bombers in the air. None of that is occurring here. So I think we need to be very careful with the language. We don't need to unnecessarily scare people. And I'm afraid that it undermines our own deterrence. It almost shows or signals to Vladimir Putin that Biden is so concerned that he may not do things that make sense, again, for this broader fight that we're in.
It has gone on a long time, maybe longer than we all predicted at the beginning, and it is now this conflict headed into the winter months, which will be difficult. Do you think that allies are doing as much as they can? Is there more that they should be doing to try and protect Ukraine's territory?
Some are doing far more than others. Look at the Poles and the Baltic states and the Brits and the United States, of course, and some are not doing enough. And I'll point the finger right at Germany, which is kind of laid back in terms of providing the Ukrainians with Abrams tanks and other things. So overall, the NATO alliance has done a good job. I think the military support has been adequate, and the diplomatic and political and economic support has been good. But there is so much more we could do to lean into this and help Ukraine win. But everybody has to get on board with this, and we're really not there yet.
Do you think Canada's doing enough?
Canada has done a lot. I have not kind of taken a look recently about what Canada is providing, but this is something where all the NATO allies need to fully support the Ukrainians. This is a war, frankly, between autocracy and democracy, which is why it's so important we stand up to Vladimir Putin right now, because Xi Jinping in China is also watching, and I know both Canada and the United States have their share of issues with China as well, but he is watching over there with regard to how we react, which is why it's critical that the West stand up to Vladimir Putin.
There's a lot going on geopolitically, so I'm gonna pick your brain a little more, and this time on what's happening in Iran and the protests there in response to the death of that young woman last month. It does seem to be continuing, and I wonder whether you think this is a turning point against the regime, or whether this is a moment, as we've seen previously, that then people just move on from.
Yeah, well, we'll see how this plays out, but it was launched, as you said, with a terrible killing of a young woman. At this point, it's gone on several weeks. It's an uprising, or at least protests, led by young women, which is equally surprising and inspiring. It's captured the attention and the support of the middle class in Iran, who for 4+ decades now have wanted political freedom, economic freedom, and I think are tired of this theocracy and its heavy virtuism and all the other costs it's imposed on society. So look, I think we can only hope it'll continue to sustain itself. I think once again the West should help freedom-loving people in Iran do so, and we'll see where this goes.
As you're watching all of these different conflicts unfold, or escalations in threats unfold, is there one that you think poses a greater risk to the world, and that we should be focused on in a different way, or a more serious way?
Well, the immediate one is, of course, Russia and Ukraine, as Putin continues to paint himself in a corner, as the Ukrainians continue battlefield success after battlefield success. He may get increasingly desperate to do things that we might not expect. So I think he's the immediate threat, but we can't take our eye off China. That is the long-term strategic threat to all of the West as well. We have a big, important party Congress coming up in a week or so. Xi Jinping will be selected for an unprecedented third term as the leader of China, and we'll be watching closely what he does once that title is bestowed upon him and he consolidates power within Beijing.
Secretary Esper, before I go, I want to ask you about Donald Trump, because in your book you call him an unprincipled person who should not be in a position of public service. And yet President Trump is out there at rallies often, again, over the weekend. He does seem to be preparing to run again. I wonder, what is your message to Americans, or perhaps more specifically to Republicans, ahead of the midterms next month, knowing that this president plans or hopes to run again?
Look, I consider myself a Reagan Republican, and what I tell my fellow Republicans is this: if you want to win elections, if you want to advance conservative policies, and Donald Trump had his fair share of successes on that front, but if you want to do so without the baggage, without the coarseness, and with the ability to win just not the White House, but the Senate and the House, then let's look to the next generation of Republican leaders who are out there who can do so, again, without all the other stuff, the baggage that President Trump brings. And look, you need leaders who will focus on the country, not themselves, and who will lead with integrity and character, and not their own self-gain. So that's been my message to Republicans as I go out on the road.
Secretary Mark Esper, thank you for the time. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.